Don't stop the car, please, don't let them find me. The rain hit the windshield like scattered gravel, each drop catching the yellow glow of streetlights before sliding into darkness, and Emily Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her old sedan idled at the intersection, the gas needle hovering just above empty, the clock on the dashboard blinking 11:42 p.m. And her phone buzzed once on the passenger seat with a message from her babysitter reminding her that Noah had finally fallen asleep after asking for her 3 times, and she exhaled slowly, trying to push past the weight in her chest, the overdue rent notice folded in her glove compartment, the double shift that left her shoulders aching, the quiet kind of exhaustion that didn't show on the outside but lived somewhere behind her eyes, and then she saw him, a figure just ahead, half collapsed near the curb where the streetlight flickered, his dark coat soaked through, one arm braced against the pavement as if the world itself had tilted too far to stand straight, and for a moment she hesitated, her foot hovering between brake and gas, because this city had taught her not to stop, not at night, not for strangers, not when you had a child waiting at home and barely enough to make it through the week, and a car passed behind her, honking sharply, snapping her back, urging her forward, telling her to keep moving like everyone else already had, but something in the way he tried to lift his head, slow, unsteady, almost like he was fighting to stay conscious, made her chest tighten, and before she could overthink it, she pulled over, the tires crunching softly against the wet gravel, her heartbeat louder now than the rain, and she stepped out, the cold air biting through her thin jacket as she approached him carefully. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her voice softer than she expected, and when he looked up, his eyes weren't wild or dangerous, just unfocused, distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. "You shouldn't be out here," she murmured, crouching slightly, noticing the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with rain and something heavier, something like a night gone wrong, and his hand reached out suddenly, not grabbing, just searching, brushing against her sleeve as if anchoring himself. "Please," he whispered again, his voice low, controlled, but breaking at the edges, "don't let them find me," and Emily frowned, glancing instinctively over her shoulder at the empty street, nothing but the hum of distant traffic and the flicker of neon from a closed diner across the block, and she shook her head slightly, grounding herself, because whatever his story was, right now he was just a man who couldn't stand on his own, and she knew what it felt like to be left alone when you needed help the most, and that was enough. "Okay," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, as she slipped her arm under his, feeling the weight of him as he leaned against her, heavier than she expected, his breath uneven but steady. "Let's get you somewhere safe," and as she guided him toward her car, she didn't notice the pair of headlights that slowed at the corner, lingering just a second too long before rolling past, disappearing into the rain like they had never been there at all. The passenger door creaked softly as Emily eased him into the seat, the worn fabric absorbing the rain from his coat, and for a brief second she paused, watching his head fall back against the headrest, his breathing uneven but calmer now, like the storm outside had moved somewhere deeper inside him instead, and she reached over, pulling the seatbelt across his chest, her fingers brushing the cold metal of an expensive watch at his wrist, far too polished, far too out of place in her world, and she swallowed that thought quickly, closing the door before circling back to the driver's side, the rain soaking through her hairline as she slid behind the wheel, shutting everything out with a firm click, the small space of the car suddenly quiet except for the steady rhythm of the wipers and the low hum of the engine, and for a moment she just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, her reflection faint in the glass, asking herself the question she had learned to ask every night. Whether she was doing the right thing, whether stopping had been a mistake, whether she could afford another problem when her life was already hanging by a thread. But then she glanced at him again, at the way his hand had relaxed slightly against the seat, no longer searching, and she exhaled slowly, shifting the car into drive. "Just get him home," she murmured under her breath, as if saying it out loud made it simpler than it really was, and she leaned closer, careful not to startle him. "Where do you live?" she asked gently, but his eyes only flickered, unfocused, his lips parting as if to answer before closing again, the silence stretching just long enough to feel uncertain, and then he whispered something too quiet to catch, something that sounded more like a memory than an address, and Emily tightened her grip on the wheel again, realizing she had no destination, no plan beyond the next few miles of wet asphalt, and she let out a soft breath, glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights or someone pulling up behind her, but the street remained empty, the rain swallowing everything beyond a few yards of visibility, and so she made a decision, the kind she had made 100 times before. Quick, imperfect, but necessary, and turned toward the only place she knew would not ask questions, a small apartment complex on the edge of town where the paint peeled from the walls and the hallway lights flickered but where no one looked twice at who came and went, and as she drove, the city blurred into streaks of gold and shadow, the tires hissing softly against the wet road, and beside her, he shifted slightly, his hand moving again, this time resting against the console, closer to hers, and for a brief second, their fingers brushed, and he stilled, as if recognizing something familiar in that small contact, something steady, something real, and his voice came again, clearer this time, though still fragile at the edges. "You stayed," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, and Emily blinked, surprised by the weight behind such simple words, and she gave a small nod even though she knew he might not see it. "Yeah," she answered quietly, eyes on the road. "I did," and he let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, and the rest of the drive passed in a silence that was not empty, but filled with something she could not quite name, something that lingered in the space between them like a promise neither of them had intended to make, and when she finally pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, the flickering lamp above casting uneven shadows across the cracked pavement, she hesitated again, looking at the worn building in front of her, knowing this was not where someone like him belonged, and yet, for tonight, it was the only place she could offer, and she turned off the engine, the sudden quiet pressing in around them, and whispered softly, almost to herself, "We are here." For a moment neither of them moved, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, the rain now lighter, almost hesitant, tapping gently against the windshield as if the night itself was catching its breath, and Emily glanced toward the building again, the dim hallway light flickering behind the glass entrance, knowing exactly what waited inside, the narrow stairs, the chipped paint, the quiet kind of struggle that never made noise but was always there, and she felt a flicker of doubt, wondering how someone like him would react once he saw it, once he understood where she had brought him, but then she looked back at him and realized he was already watching her, his eyes clearer now, not fully steady but no longer lost, and there was something different in his expression, something focused, almost searching. "This is your place?" he asked, his voice low but controlled, and Emily hesitated just a second before nodding. "It is not much," she admitted quietly, pushing the door open and stepping out into the damp air again, moving around to his side, "but it is safe," and he studied her for a brief moment, as if weighing something unspoken, before reaching for the door handle, his movements slow but deliberate, and when he stood, he swayed slightly, instinctively steadying himself with a hand against the roof of the car, and Emily stepped closer without thinking, her hand lightly supporting his arm, the contact simple, practical, but grounding, and he did not pull away this time, instead letting out a breath that seemed to carry more than just exhaustion, and together they moved toward the entrance, their footsteps soft against the wet pavement, the distant hum of traffic fading further behind them, and as they reached the door, Emily pushed it open, the faint scent of old wood and cleaning solution greeting them, familiar and oddly comforting, and she guided him inside, past the row of mailboxes with peeling numbers, toward the narrow staircase, second floor, she said softly, more out of habit than necessity, and he nodded once, gripping the railing as they began to climb, each step measured, careful, and for a moment the only sound was the echo of their footsteps and the quiet rhythm of their breathing, and halfway up, he paused, his hand tightening slightly on the railing, not in panic but in thought, and he glanced at her again, his gaze more present now, more aware. "Why did you stop?" he asked, the question simple but heavy in a way she had not expected, and Emily blinked, caught off guard, because she had not really thought about it, not in words at least, and she let out a small breath, looking ahead at the landing before answering, "Because no one else did," she said, her voice steady, honest, and for a second the air between them shifted, something quiet but undeniable settling into place, and he held her gaze just a moment longer before nodding slowly, as if that answer meant more than she could understand, and when they reached her door, she fumbled briefly with her keys, the familiar metallic jingle breaking the stillness, before pushing it open to reveal the small apartment beyond, the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner, a child's blanket draped over the couch, a pair of tiny shoes near the doorway, and she stepped aside, giving him space to enter, suddenly aware of every imperfection, every sign of the life she was trying so hard to hold together, but he did not comment. Did not hesitate, instead stepping inside with a quiet kind of respect, his eyes taking in the space not with judgment but with something closer to understanding, and as the door closed behind them, shutting out the rain and the rest of the world, Emily realized that whatever had started on that dark street had not ended there, it had only just begun. The door clicked softly behind them, sealing the quiet of the apartment around them, and for a moment Emily stood still, watching as he took a slow step forward into the small living room, his eyes adjusting to the warm but modest light, taking in the worn couch, the neatly folded blanket, the stack of unopened mail on the corner table, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator from the kitchen, and she felt that familiar tension rise in her chest, the instinct to apologize for what she did not have, for what she could not offer, but she stopped herself, pressing her lips together as she set her keys down, reminding herself that she had brought him here to help, not to explain her life, and he seemed to understand that without her saying a word. His gaze moving slowly across the space before settling on the small pair of shoes by the door, his expression shifting, softer. Now, more grounded, you have a child, he said quietly, not asking, just stating, and Emily nodded, her voice low as she replied, a son, he is asleep, and she instinctively glanced toward the closed bedroom door at the end of the hallway, as if the mention alone could wake him, and when she looked back, she noticed the way his posture had changed, less guarded, less distant, like something inside him had settled just a little, and she gestured toward the couch. You can sit, she said. Moving toward the kitchen without waiting for a response, needing something to do, something familiar to steady herself, and she filled a glass with water, the tap running softly as she tried not to think about how unusual this night had become, how quickly a stranger had crossed into her world, and when she turned back, he was already seated, leaning slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His head lowered just enough to suggest he was still gathering himself, and she stepped closer. Handing him the glass, her fingers brushing his again for just a second, and he accepted it with a quiet nod, lifting it slowly, as if even that small action required focus, and the room fell into a gentle silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of rain against the windows, and Emily watched him carefully, noticing the details now that she had not seen before. The clean lines of his coat despite the rain, the precision of his movements even in exhaustion, the kind of quiet control that did not disappear completely, even when everything else seemed to, and it made her wonder who he really was, what kind of life he came from, what kind of night had brought him to that street, but she did not ask, because she had learned that questions sometimes carried answers she was not ready to hear, and after a moment, he spoke again, his voice steadier now. You should not have taken that risk, he said, his eyes lifting to meet hers, and Emily gave a small, almost tired smile, shaking her head slightly. Maybe, she replied, leaning back against the edge of the table, but sometimes people need someone to take a chance on them. And the words hung there, simple but heavy, and he held her gaze. A second longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before he looked down at the glass in his hands, as if considering something carefully, and then, quieter, almost to himself, he said, it has been a long time since anyone did that, and Emily did not respond right away, because there was something in his tone that felt less like a statement and more like a truth he had not meant to reveal, and instead she turned slightly, lowering her voice as she added, you can stay here tonight, just until you feel better, and for a brief moment, the air shifted again, something unspoken passing between them, and when he looked up this time, his eyes were clearer, more certain, and he nodded once, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to trust, and in that quiet exchange, without either of them realizing it, the distance between stranger and something more had already begun to disappear. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each second stretching longer than it should, and Emily moved quietly across the room, pulling a thin blanket from the back of the couch before placing it within his reach, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled between them, and he watched her without speaking, his gaze steady now, clearer than before, following the small, thoughtful movements she made as if trying to understand them, as if they meant more than they should, and she stepped back slightly, folding her arms for a moment before letting them fall again, unsure what to do with the silence that lingered, because it was not uncomfortable, not exactly, just unfamiliar, like standing in a moment that had not been planned, and she glanced once more toward the hallway, listening for any sound from Noah's room, the quiet reassuring her that he was still asleep. Still untouched by whatever strange turn the night had taken, and when she looked back, he had shifted slightly on the couch, sitting more upright now, the glass of water half empty in his hand, his fingers wrapped around it with a steadiness that had not been there before. "You should rest," she said softly, her voice low enough not to carry beyond the room, and he gave a small nod, though his eyes did not leave her. "And you?" he asked. The question simple but direct, and she hesitated. A faint smile touching her lips as she shrugged lightly. "I will be fine," she replied, the words automatic, practiced, the same answer she had given 100 times before, even when it was not entirely true, and something in his expression shifted at that, as if he recognized the pattern, the quiet way she placed herself second without thinking, and he leaned back slowly, setting the glass aside on the table, his shoulders relaxing into the worn cushions, and for a moment it seemed like he might say something more, something that had been building behind his steady gaze, but instead he simply exhaled, closing his eyes briefly, and the tension that had followed him into the apartment finally began to loosen, not completely, but enough to be felt, and Emily turned toward the small kitchen again, rinsing the empty glass under the tap just to give herself something to focus on, something ordinary. But her mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he had said those few words earlier, to the quiet weight behind them, and she found herself wondering what kind of life left a person so guarded, so controlled even in vulnerability, and before she could follow that thought any further, a soft sound broke the silence, a small creak from the hallway, followed by the faint shuffle of tiny footsteps, and Emily froze for a second before turning quickly, her heart tightening just slightly, and there in the doorway stood Noah, his hair tousled from sleep, his small blanket clutched loosely in one hand, his eyes heavy but curious as they adjusted to the light. "Mom," he murmured, his voice soft, uncertain, and Emily moved toward him immediately, kneeling down to his level, her voice gentle, reassuring. "Hey, you should be asleep," she whispered, brushing a hand through his hair, but Noah's gaze had already shifted past her, landing on the unfamiliar figure on the couch, and he blinked slowly, studying him with the quiet honesty only a child could have, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the distance between two completely different worlds narrowing in the simplest, most unexpected way, and Noah tilted his head slightly, his small voice breaking the silence again. "Who is that?" And Emily glanced back over her shoulder, meeting his eyes for just a second before answering, her tone calm but careful, just someone who needed help, and when she turned back, she did not miss the way the man on the couch had opened his eyes again, watching the scene quietly, something softer, something almost unfamiliar settling into his expression as he took in the small, fragile world she had just revealed to him, and in that moment, without a single word exchanged, something deeper began to shift, something neither of them could fully see yet, but both could feel. Noah took a small step forward, his bare feet barely making a sound against the floor, his eyes fixed on the man sitting on the couch with a kind of quiet curiosity that only children carried, unfiltered and honest, and Emily instinctively reached for his shoulder, her hand resting there gently as if to anchor him, to remind him that everything was still safe, still familiar, even with a stranger in their space, and she offered him a soft smile, the kind she used when the world felt uncertain. But she needed him to feel none of it. "He is just resting for a little while," she said quietly, brushing her thumb along his arm, but Noah did not look away, his gaze steady as he studied the man with careful attention. And on the couch, Alexander shifted slightly, pushing himself up just enough to meet the child's eyes at a more level angle, his posture instinctively softening, his voice lower now, gentler than it had been all night. "Hey," he said simply, the word carrying no weight of status or control, just a quiet acknowledgement, and Noah blinked once, as if processing the moment, before taking another small step closer, his blanket dragging slightly behind him, and Emily felt a flicker of hesitation, unsure how this would unfold, unsure how much of this night should touch her son's world. But she did not pull him back, because something in the air felt different now, calmer, safer in a way she could not fully explain, and Noah tilted his head slightly, his voice soft but direct. "Are you sick?" he asked, the question simple and sincere, and for the first time, something that almost resembled a faint smile touched Alexander's expression, subtle but real, and he shook his head slowly. "Not exactly," he replied, his tone careful, as if choosing words that would make sense to a child. "Just had a long night," and Noah seemed to consider that answer seriously, his small brows pulling together for a moment before relaxing again, and he nodded once, as if that explanation was enough, and then, without hesitation, he reached out, holding his blanket forward slightly. "You can use this if you are cold," he said, his voice carrying that effortless kindness that had not yet learned how to expect anything in return, and Emily's breath caught just a little at the gesture, her eyes softening as she watched, because it was such a small thing, such a quiet echo of everything she had tried to teach him without ever saying it out loud. And Alexander looked at the blanket for a moment, then back at Noah, something shifting in his gaze, something deeper than gratitude, something that seemed almost unfamiliar to him, and he accepted it slowly, carefully, as if it were something far more valuable than it appeared. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now, more grounded. And Noah gave a small nod, satisfied, before turning back toward Emily, the brief moment already settling into something natural, something uncomplicated, and she guided him gently back toward the hallway, her hand resting lightly on his back as she leaned down, whispering softly, "Let us get you back to bed," and Noah did not resist, his steps slow and sleepy as they moved away, but just before disappearing into his room, he glanced back one more time, his eyes meeting Alexander's for a second longer, as if silently confirming something, and then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click, leaving the apartment quiet once again, and Emily stood there for a moment, her hand still resting on the doorframe, her thoughts catching up to what had just happened, and when she turned back, she found Alexander watching her. The blanket now resting across his lap, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but thoughtful in a way that suggested something inside him had shifted in a way he had not expected, and after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice steady but softer than before, "You are raising him well," and Emily let out a quiet breath, a faint smile touching her lips as she nodded slightly. "I am trying," she replied, and for a moment neither of them said anything more, but the silence that followed was different now, warmer, filled with something unspoken yet deeply understood, as if the smallest act of kindness had quietly begun to change more than just one night. The apartment settled into a deeper kind of quiet after Noah's door closed, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock becoming the only sounds that filled the space, and Emily moved slowly back into the living room, her steps lighter now, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had taken hold, and when she looked at Alexander again, she noticed how differently he held himself. The tension that had once shaped every movement now softened, replaced by something more grounded, more present, and he glanced down briefly at the small blanket still resting across his lap, his fingers brushing its edge almost absent-mindedly, as if the simple gesture from a child had left a mark he had not expected, and Emily leaned slightly against the wall, her arms loosely crossed, watching him for a moment before speaking, her voice quiet but steady. "He does that sometimes," she said, a faint warmth in her tone. "He thinks everyone deserves to feel okay," and Alexander let out a slow breath, his gaze lifting to meet hers, something thoughtful lingering behind his eyes. "That is rare," he replied, his voice low, not dismissive, not distant, but reflective, as if he was speaking from a place far removed from the small apartment around him, and Emily tilted her head slightly, a hint of curiosity breaking through her usual reserve. "What is?" she asked, and he paused for just a second, as if considering how much to say, how much of himself to reveal in a place that was not his world. "Kindness without calculation," he answered finally, his tone even, but the weight behind it unmistakable, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, understanding more than she let on, because she had seen the opposite too many times to count, had learned the difference the hard way, and she pushed herself gently off the wall, moving toward the small hallway closet, pulling out an extra pillow and placing it on the couch beside him, her movements quiet, practical. "You should try to sleep," she said softly, adjusting the blanket slightly so it covered him better, the gesture simple but instinctive, and he watched her again, that same quiet attention, as if every small act carried meaning he was not used to receiving, and when she stepped back, he nodded once, slower this time, I will, he said, his voice calm, and for a brief moment it seemed like the conversation might end there, like the night would finally settle into rest, but then he spoke again, his tone shifting just slightly, more deliberate now. Emily, he said, her name sounding different in his voice, more intentional, and she paused, looking at him with a hint of surprise, because she did not remember telling him, and he seemed to catch that, a faint, almost apologetic look crossing his expression. You said it earlier, he added quietly, clarifying without over-explaining, and she gave a small nod, letting it pass, though a part of her noted the detail, the way he had paid attention even when he had seemed barely present. And he continued, his gaze steady now. Tonight, you chose to help someone you did not know, without asking anything in return, he said, his words measured, careful. That is not something people forget, and Emily felt something shift slightly at that, something subtle but real, and she looked away for just a second, a faint smile touching her lips as she shook her head lightly. It was just the right thing to do, she replied, her voice soft but certain, and he studied her for a moment longer, as if that answer meant more than she intended, before leaning back slowly into the couch, his eyes closing again, not in exhaustion this time, but in something closer to trust, and Emily stood there quietly, watching him for a few seconds, making sure he was settled, before turning off the lamp near the window, the room dimming into a softer glow, and as she moved toward her own room, pausing briefly at Noah's door to listen for his steady breathing, she could not shake the feeling that something about this night was different, not just unusual, but meaningful in a way she could not yet explain. And behind her, on the couch, Alexander remained still, the small blanket draped across him, his breathing even now, but his mind far from asleep, turning over the events of the night, the choices made, the kindness given without hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, the world he had built, the one defined by control and distance, felt just a little less certain, as if something as simple as being seen, truly seen, had quietly begun to change everything. The night stretched quietly across the small apartment, the kind of silence that felt heavier after everything that had already happened, and sometime between the ticking clock and the distant hum of passing cars, Emily finally drifted into a light, restless sleep, her body exhausted but her mind still lingering on the unfamiliar presence just beyond her bedroom door. And in the living room, Alexander remained still for a long time, his eyes closed but his thoughts far from quiet, replaying every moment with a clarity that surprised him, the rain, the street, her voice, the way she had not hesitated when others had, and eventually, the weight of it all gave way to sleep, not deep, not complete, but enough to pull him into a few hours of rare stillness. And when morning came, it arrived softly, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains in narrow beams, illuminating the worn edges of the room in a gentle glow. And Alexander stirred first, his eyes opening slowly as he adjusted to the unfamiliar surroundings, the ceiling lower than he was used to, the quiet more personal, more real, and for a moment he did not move, simply observing, listening, grounding himself in where he was, and then he sat up, the small blanket still draped across him, and he paused, looking down at it again, his fingers brushing its surface thoughtfully, before setting it aside with care. And as he stood, his movement steady now, fully in control, there was a shift in his posture, a return of the quiet authority that had only been hidden, never gone, and yet something remained different, something softened at the edges, and from down the hall came the faint sound of movement, a drawer opening, a soft voice speaking gently, followed by the small, sleepy response of a child, and Alexander turned toward the sound instinctively, his attention drawn not by urgency, but by something quieter, something he had not realized he had missed. And moments later, Emily stepped into the living room, her hair loosely tied back, her expression calm but slightly surprised to see him already awake, and she paused just inside the doorway, taking in the sight of him standing there, no longer the man she had found on the street, but not entirely the same either. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying that same steady warmth, and he inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. "Good morning," he replied, his tone composed, clear, and for a brief second, the difference between them felt more visible, the distance between their worlds quietly present in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke, and yet it did not feel like a barrier, not anymore. And Emily stepped further into the room, her hands lightly brushing against the edge of the table as if grounding herself in the familiar. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her eyes searching his just enough to show she meant it, and he considered the question carefully, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper than that, and then he answered, simply, "Better." And she nodded once, accepting that without pressing further, and there was a brief pause, the kind that carried unspoken questions, unspoken decisions, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, his movements deliberate, controlled, and he pulled out a small, sleek phone, the kind that did not belong in a place like this, and Emily's eyes flickered to it briefly, noticing the detail without commenting, and he looked at the screen for just a moment, the faintest shift in his expression betraying something beneath the surface. Something unresolved, before he lowered it again without making a call, and when he looked back at her, there was something different in his gaze, something more certain, more intentional. "I owe you more than a thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore, and Emily shook her head almost immediately, a small, instinctive gesture. "You do not owe me anything," she replied, her tone gentle but firm, and he held her gaze for a second longer, as if measuring that response, as if understanding that this was not a situation that could be settled with something simple, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the morning light stretching between them, illuminating the space where two completely different lives had unexpectedly crossed, and in that quiet, something unspoken began to take shape, not yet defined, not yet understood, but real enough to be felt, like the beginning of something that would not end with the morning. Emily moved toward the small kitchen, reaching for the coffee maker that had seen better days, the quiet routine grounding her in a way nothing else could, and the soft sound of water filling the pot broke the stillness between them, giving both of them something to hold on to, something ordinary in a moment that felt anything but, and behind her, she could feel his presence without looking, the way he stood still, observing, not with judgment but with attention, as if every small detail mattered, and when she turned back, she found him exactly where she had left him, yet somehow different again, more composed, more certain, the man she had picked up from the street now barely visible beneath the calm authority that had returned, and for a second, the contrast struck her more clearly than before, making her wonder what kind of life he would return to once he walked out that door, and she poured 2 cups without asking, placing one on the table before him, the simple gesture bridging a distance she did not fully understand, and he accepted it with a slight nod, his fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic as if grounding himself again, and the silence stretched for a moment, not uncomfortable, but filled with things neither of them had said yet, and then from the hallway came the soft patter of footsteps again, lighter this time, more awake, and Noah appeared, dressed in a small t-shirt and jeans that were just slightly too big, his hair still tousled but his eyes brighter now, and he walked straight into the room with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted his world completely, stopping beside Emily and leaning gently against her side, his gaze lifting toward Alexander without hesitation, and for a moment the three of them stood there in a simple, unplanned stillness, something about it almost surreal, and Emily rested a hand lightly on Noah's shoulder, her voice calm as she said, "This is Noah," and Alexander inclined his head again, this time more formally, though his tone remained soft, "Nice to meet you," and Noah studied him for a second before giving a small nod in return, as if deciding that was enough, and then he reached for the edge of the table, peeking at the cup in front of Alexander, curiosity flickering across his face. "Is that coffee?" he asked, and Emily smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. "Yes, but not for you," she said gently, and Noah seemed to accept that without complaint, his attention already shifting again, taking in the room, the morning, the presence of someone new, and Alexander watched the exchange quietly, something thoughtful settling deeper in his expression, something that had nothing to do with business or control, and everything to do with what he was seeing for the first time in a long while, and after a moment, he set the cup down carefully, his movements precise, deliberate, and he reached once more into his coat, this time pulling out a slim leather wallet, placing it on the table with a quiet finality that made Emily's attention sharpen slightly, and when he looked at her, his gaze was steady, composed, carrying that same quiet weight as before. "I meant what I said," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I cannot walk away from this as if it meant nothing," and Emily felt a flicker of tension rise, not fear, but resistance, because she knew where conversations like this usually went, knew the imbalance they often created, and she shook her head slightly before he could continue, her tone gentle but clear. "You do not have to do anything," she said, meeting his eyes directly, and for a second, something almost like surprise crossed his expression, subtle but real, as if he was not used to being told no in such a quiet, unwavering way, and he held her gaze a moment longer, studying her, understanding something deeper in that refusal, something that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with dignity, and slowly, he closed the wallet again, not insisting, not pushing, but not dismissing the moment either, and the room fell into silence once more, the morning light growing stronger through the window, illuminating the simple scene of a woman, a child, and a man who did not yet belong, but no longer felt like a stranger, and somewhere beneath that quiet, something continued to shift, something that could not be undone by a single decision, or a single morning, but would instead unfold in ways none of them could yet see. The quiet tension in the room did not disappear after his hand closed the wallet, it simply changed, settling into something more restrained, more thoughtful, and Emily turned slightly, reaching for a small plate on the counter as if the motion itself could soften the moment, placing a piece of toast in front of Noah, who accepted it without question, his attention already shifting to something simple and familiar. And that small normalcy seemed to anchor the space again, pulling it away from whatever unspoken line they had almost crossed, and Alexander watched it all carefully, the ease between mother and child, the quiet rhythm of their morning, the way nothing here was rushed or calculated, and it stood in sharp contrast to the world he was used to, where every second carried weight, every interaction had purpose, and for a brief moment he said nothing, simply observing, letting the silence work in a way he was not accustomed to, and then he straightened slightly, the shift subtle but unmistakable, as if a decision had settled into place, and his gaze returned to Emily, steady, focused. "Then I will not offer you money," he said calmly, his tone measured, not defensive, not offended, but resolved, and Emily looked at him, a faint crease forming between her brows as she tried to understand where he was going, and he continued, his voice even, "But that does not mean I walk away." And there was something in the way he said it, something quiet but absolute, that made her pause, because it did not sound like obligation, it did not sound like repayment, it sounded like something else entirely, something chosen, and she leaned slightly against the edge of the counter again, her arms loosely folded, her posture guarded but not closed. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice calm but careful, and Alexander took a small breath, as if choosing his words with more intention than usual. "It means I would like to see you again," he said simply, no embellishment, no pressure, just a statement that hung between them with unexpected weight, and for a second Emily did not respond, her mind catching up to what he had actually said, because it was not what she had expected, not what she had prepared herself for, and she glanced briefly toward Noah, who was quietly focused on his breakfast, unaware of the shift happening just a few feet away, and then she looked back at Alexander, studying him more closely now, searching for something in his expression that might explain it, but there was no trace of arrogance, no assumption, just a calm certainty that felt strangely unfamiliar, and she let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a refusal, something in between. "You do not even know me," she said softly, the words more observation than rejection, and he nodded once, accepting that without argument. "That is true," he replied, his gaze steady. "But I know enough to recognize something rare when I see it," and the simplicity of that answer caught her off guard more than anything else had, because it was not exaggerated, not overly persuasive, it was quiet, almost understated, and yet it carried a sincerity that was difficult to dismiss, and Emily felt that same subtle shift again, the one she had been trying to ignore since the night before. Something opening just slightly where she had long kept things closed, and she looked down for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding herself before meeting his eyes again. "My life is not simple," she said, her tone honest, unfiltered. "I do not have time for things that complicate it," and Alexander listened without interrupting, without reacting, simply taking in the words as they were meant, and after a brief pause, he nodded slowly. "Then I will not complicate it," he said, his voice calm, almost certain in a way that suggested he believed it, and Emily held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, perhaps a reason to dismiss it, perhaps a reason to believe it, and the room fell quiet again, the morning light now fully filling the space, illuminating everything clearly, leaving no shadows to hide behind, and in that stillness, the question was no longer whether their worlds were different, but whether either of them was willing to step even slightly toward the other, and neither of them answered that out loud, but something in the air suggested that the choice had already begun to make itself. Emily did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything she could have spoken, her eyes lingering on him just long enough to acknowledge the weight of what he had said before she turned slightly, reaching for Noah's empty plate and moving it toward the sink, the small motion giving her a moment to think, to steady the part of her that had already begun to shift in ways she had not planned, and behind her, Alexander remained still, not pressing, not filling the space with more words, something in him understanding that this was not a moment to control, but one to wait through, and the quiet stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, not awkward, but meaningful, and when Emily turned back, her expression was calm again, composed in the way she had learned to be when life asked more of her than she was ready to give. "I have work today," she said simply, her tone neutral but not dismissive, and he nodded once, accepting that without question. "Of course," he replied, and there was no disappointment in his voice, only acknowledgement, as if he understood that her life did not pause for unexpected moments, no matter how significant they felt, and she moved toward the small hook by the door, reaching for her keys, the familiar routine pulling her back into the rhythm she knew, the one that did not leave room for uncertainty, and Noah slid off his chair, already moving toward his backpack, the simple normalcy of the morning continuing without hesitation. And Alexander watched it all quietly, taking in the details, the efficiency, the quiet resilience that defined everything about her world, and as Emily slipped on her jacket, she paused for just a second, glancing toward him again, something unspoken lingering behind her eyes, not quite a decision, not quite a refusal, just a moment of recognition, and then she spoke, her voice softer this time. "You should probably head back to wherever you came from," she said, not unkind, just practical, and he gave a small nod, understanding the meaning beneath the words, the boundary she was setting, the space she needed to protect, and he reached for his coat, slipping it on with the same composed precision, his movement steady, controlled, the version of him she had glimpsed beneath the exhaustion now fully present again, and for a moment, the difference between them felt sharper, more defined, the quiet gap between their worlds returning as something real, something that could not be ignored, and yet, as he stepped closer to the door, there was no sense of distance in the way he looked at her, no detachment, only that same quiet certainty that had not wavered since the night before, and he stopped just short of leaving, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "I meant what I said," he repeated, his voice calm, not insistent, just steady, and Emily met his gaze again, holding it this time, not turning away, not deflecting, and for a brief second, something passed between them that neither of them tried to define, something that existed beyond circumstance, beyond logic, and she gave a small nod, not agreement, not rejection, just acknowledgement, and then she reached for the door, opening it slowly, the morning air filtering in, cooler now, clearer than the night before, and Alexander stepped through without hesitation, pausing just outside as if the moment deserved one last look, and when he turned back, his expression was composed, but his eyes held something deeper, something that had not been there before. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said quietly, and she nodded once in return, her voice just as steady. "You too," and with that, he turned and walked away, his figure moving across the small parking lot with a confidence that felt entirely different from the man she had found on the street, and Emily stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she needed to, watching until he disappeared from view, and only then did she close the door, the soft click echoing faintly in the apartment, but the quiet that followed was no longer the same, because something had shifted, something she could not undo, and as she picked up her keys again, guiding Noah toward the door, she told herself it was just another morning, just another day, but somewhere beneath that certainty, a small, persistent thought remained, one she could not quite silence, that maybe this was not the end of something unexpected, but the beginning of something she had never allowed herself to imagine. The day moved forward with the quiet momentum of routine, the kind that did not pause for reflection, and Emily found herself caught in it as she always was, dropping Noah off at school with a gentle reminder to be good, offering a quick hug before watching him disappear through the doors with the same small confidence he carried everywhere, and then she drove across town to her first shift, the familiar streets passing by in a blur of traffic lights and storefronts, yet something felt different, something subtle but persistent, like a thought she could not quite shake, and more than once, she caught herself replaying the night before, the rain, the moment she had almost driven past, the way everything had shifted because she had not, and she pushed it aside each time, focusing instead on the orders she needed to deliver, the customers waiting, the bills that did not care about anything beyond being paid. And hours passed in that steady rhythm, until the late afternoon sun began to soften, casting longer shadows across the city, and she pulled into a small grocery store parking lot, stepping out of her car with a quiet breath, her shoulders tired but her mind still moving, and as she walked toward the entrance, she noticed it before she fully registered it, a sleek black car parked near the curb, out of place in a way that was impossible to ignore, its polished surface catching the light in sharp contrast to everything around it, and she slowed slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, because something about it felt familiar, though she could not immediately say why, and then the door opened, smooth, precise, and he stepped out, the same composed presence she had seen that morning, but now entirely within his own world again, his posture confident, his expression calm, the distance between who he had been the night before and who he was now fully visible, and for a moment she simply stood there, caught between surprise and something else she could not name, and he saw her almost instantly, as if he had been expecting her, and he walked toward her with the same steady pace, unhurried but certain, and when he stopped a few feet away, there was no hesitation in his gaze, no uncertainty in his voice. "I told you I would not walk away," he said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a simple truth, and Emily let out a small breath, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding. "How did you find me?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with curiosity, and he gave the faintest hint of a smile, not arrogant, not dismissive, just acknowledging the difference between them. "I have resources," he replied, his voice even, and she shook her head slightly, almost amused despite herself. "Of course you do," she said softly, and for a moment the tension between their worlds surfaced again, clear and undeniable, but it did not feel like a barrier anymore, not in the way it might have before, and he stepped a fraction closer, not invading her space, just closing the distance enough to make his intention clear. "I am not here to complicate your life," he continued, his tone steady. "I am here because I meant what I said," and Emily studied him carefully, searching his expression, measuring the sincerity behind his words, and she realized that nothing about this felt impulsive, nothing about it felt like a passing moment, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else had, because it meant this was real, in a way she had not allowed herself to consider, and she glanced briefly toward the store, toward the life she knew, before looking back at him again. And for a second, the noise of the world seemed to fade, leaving only the space between them, the quiet weight of a choice she had not expected to face, and she let out a slow breath, her voice softer now, less guarded than before. "You really do not give up easily," she said, and something in his expression shifted again, not pride, not persistence for its own sake, but something deeper, something grounded. "Not when it matters," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer lingered between them, steady and undeniable, and for the first time since the night began, Emily did not look away. Emily held his gaze for a long moment, the noise of the parking lot slowly returning around them, carts rolling across pavement, distant voices blending into the hum of an ordinary afternoon, but none of it seemed to matter in that space between them, and she felt it clearly now, the quiet shift that had begun the night before, no longer something she could dismiss as coincidence or kindness that would fade with daylight, but something steady, something choosing to remain, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she stepped closer, not enough to erase the distance between their worlds, but enough to acknowledge that it was no longer something she was standing completely apart from, and her voice, when she spoke, was softer than before, less guarded. "I do not understand why this matters to you," she said honestly, her eyes searching his, not for answers she expected, but for truth she could recognize, and Alexander did not look away, did not hesitate, his expression calm but grounded in something deeper than before. "Because you saw me when I had nothing to offer you," he replied quietly, his words simple but carrying a weight that did not need explanation, "and you stayed anyway," and Emily felt something tighten in her chest at that, not discomfort, not fear, but something closer to recognition, because she understood what it meant to be overlooked, to be dismissed when there was nothing to gain, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the meaning of that truth settling between them, and she glanced down briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her bag before she looked back up again, a faint smile touching her lips, not out of certainty, but out of something softer, something willing to consider what she had been holding back from. My life is still not simple, she said, repeating it, but this time her tone carried less resistance, more clarity, and Alexander nodded once, his expression steady. I know, he said, and there was no attempt to change that, no promise to fix it, just an understanding that felt more real than anything else he could have offered, and that was what shifted something inside her, not the difference between them, not the possibilities he represented, but the fact that he was not trying to erase who she was to make space for himself, and she took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel intentional, and for the first time, she allowed herself to meet him without holding back. Without guarding every part of what this could mean, then we start with something simple, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still lingered beneath it, and he watched her carefully, something in his gaze softening, not with relief, but with respect. Simple is good, he replied, and there was a faint hint of something warmer in his tone now, something that had not been there before, and Emily nodded once. The smallest agreement, but one that carried more weight than anything she had said so far, and she glanced toward the store again before looking back at him, a quiet, almost amused breath escaping her as she added, I have to finish my shift, and he gave a slight nod, stepping back just enough to give her space, not retreating, just allowing, and as she turned to go, she paused for a brief second, glancing over her shoulder at him. Do not make this complicated, she said softly. A hint of warning, a hint of trust, and Alexander met her gaze. Without hesitation, his voice calm, certain in a way that no longer felt distant. I will not, he said, and this time, when she walked away, she did not feel like she was leaving something behind, but stepping forward into something she had not planned, something uncertain, but real, and as the afternoon carried on and the world moved the way it always did, neither of them could have fully explained what had begun, but they both understood it in the simplest way possible, that sometimes the most important things did not start with grand moments or perfect timing, but with a single choice to stay when it would have been easier to walk away, and that choice, once made, had a way of changing everything that came after.